Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. And I'm just so pleased that there are so many people with us tonight because we're in for a good time looking at some really incredible images together. So we'll just dive in. Thank you so much for the very nice introduction, too. So over the course of the next hour or so, we'll be looking at many of Edward Hopper's most famous works, some of his lesser known works, and exploring them in perhaps new and different ways too. So we've got sort of a classic Edward Hopper on the title screen here right now. It's called Summertime. It's from 1943. I think this is the kind of image that a lot of people associate with the name Edward Hopper, a solitary figure standing in the sunlight. There's some sort of mysterious element to it. And it sort of invites you to create your own story around it. Who is this woman? What is this building she just emerged from? The open window sort of next to the door. What is she pondering as she stands in the sunlight? Who's she waiting for? So Edward Hopper offers up so much this way. And we'll have a good time sort of diving into these. But I feel like it's important to note that Edward Hopper has a new relevance in our lives these days, doesn't he? I think right as COVID-19 hit, all of us were sort of thinking of deserted streets and empty theaters and that sort of thing. And then all of a sudden, his paintings have this new resonance in our lives. And I think that's important for us to sort of meditate on for a moment. But I also wanted to just share with you some of the things that Edward Hopper himself, the artist, lived through during his nice long life, because he lived through a pandemic as well, which is sort of interesting for us to think about. So he turned 18 years old at the turn of the century, so when it turned 1900. And we all know that there's always some sort of like global tension whenever there's a new century. He was in his 30s at the start of World War I and through the 1918 flu. He married in the 1920s when he himself was already in his 40s, and he was middle-aged through the Great Depression. By the time America entered World War II, Edward Hopper was in his 60s, and he died at the age of 84 during the cultural revolutions of the 1960s. So what a life, what an incredible amount of upheaval he lived through. And I think it's good for us to keep all of that in mind as we're thinking of these images. So in particular, the idea that the world was changing and that things were sort of frightening, but he could create these images that still, I mean, to this day resonate with all of us, right? All right, so let's talk a little bit more about sunlight and solitude before we dive into the program overview and look at how we'll navigate the next hour together. So I think these are a few more sort of iconic Edward Hopper images. These are the kinds of images that we think of when we hear the artist's name. Solitary figures, in this case, we're seeing two women from behind. We're sort of disconnected from them. They're not aware of our presence viewing them. This is New York interior from 1921 on the left. It's at the Whitney Museum. And then Room in Brooklyn from 1932 on the right, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So one word that gets overused every single time people talk about Edward Hopper is, of course, the word loneliness. And it's so hard to dance around this word because it seems so relevant, but I'm going to try my best not to overuse it. If you have a drink with you tonight, feel free to take a drink every time I say lonely. But Edward Hopper himself even said, the loneliness thing is overdone. So I think it's upon us to try and think of these different ways, but this is our slide to sort of think about this idea of being alone and what he's really capturing, because it's a powerful thing and it's a thing that we don't talk about a lot as human beings. So Olivia Lang, who wrote The Lonely City, she recently wrote in the New York Times, loneliness is a taboo state in our social world, and part of its extraordinary pain has to do with shame. So we never really talk about feeling lonely, maybe we do more so in the age of COVID-19. But Edward Hopper's paintings, in touching upon this and capturing it, tap into something that we all feel and that we don't express or communicate very well. So there's a power there. And he does it not just with figures, but sometimes with places too. This is his painting called Early Sunday Morning from 1930. This is also at the Whitney Museum. And this is a depiction of 7th Avenue, right on the cusp of the Depression. And we see these long shadows as the day is just beginning. We see sort of signs of life, with curtains drawn and the barbershop pole and that sort of thing, but no people here occupying the space. And there's a sense of solitude here that can be very powerful. And one little element that he includes here, which always changes this painting for me every time I really think about it, because this is a long, low brick building, but then he's included just behind it the suggestion of a skyscraper. He does it by just putting a black square there at the top right, and it becomes this sort of looming presence, a sense of dread in this case, and so it changes the picture dramatically. And somehow we know we're not in Nebraska, we're in New York City, but there's something else happening here. So one last note on sunlight and solitude, this bigger idea is I wanted to hit home with this picture in particular, which is called Morning Sun. This is from 1952, and it's at the Columbus Museum of Art. And so here we see, again, a solitary female figure. She's in an apartment. She's gazing at this huge window here. And she seems to be lost in thought, seems to be unaware of our presence. And because she's sort of turned away from us, but what Edward Hopper has done here, sort of parallelogram of bright light behind her. And it almost functions like a comic book in some ways, where it's like a thought bubble. It's almost inviting us into her interior space to put ourselves in her place and to do some perspective taking. What would she be thinking or feeling as she's sitting on this bed in this warm sunlight all by herself? So many different ways to kind of enter these paintings and to consider them, but let's get going with the actual program itself. So we've talked a little bit about social distancing, sunlight and solitude. I wanted to introduce you to the artist. This is him in a self-portrait from 1930. And so we'll talk a little bit about his biography. We'll talk about his travels in Paris, his early work in New York City. We'll talk about the tremendous influence of his wife, Josephine, their travels to the Cape Cod. And then the last few sections are really the sections I'm most excited about. So I wanted to kind of move quickly towards them. Edward Hopper's work and its connection to film noir. And then thinking about Edward Hopper sort of beyond the category of realism. So he's usually always placed squarely in the category of American realism. And for the most part, art historians don't really think about how his work is interacting or was interacting with other work at the same time, particularly the more avant-garde work that was being produced. So we'll dive into that. And so I'll move through the rest of the material somewhat quickly so we can spend some time there. So Edward Hopper, introduction and bio. Edward Hopper was born just north of New York City in a town named Nyack. You can see it's up here where the pin has dropped. And once you're ready to stop socially distancing and ready to go on a little trip, his childhood home, which you see on the right, is now the Edward Hopper House Museum and Study Center. I think they have a lot of his early work and sort of ephemera there, which might be really interesting to look at. So he was born to, a very comfortable middle-class existence. This is him and his sister over here on the left. And his sister's named Mary, and he looks like a very young boy here. And he was probably only about 9 years old when he drew this picture that's on the right. Supposedly, he drew it on the back of a report card. I don't know when the signature was added, but I think we all know that he's always had this kind of attraction to the sea. So I think it's really interesting that one of these early works is a young boy on the edge of the water like this. So from a young age, actually from the age of 5, he really showed a strong interest in the arts. And so that same house museum oftentimes puts on exhibitions that feature some of his earliest work. The work on the left is his first signed and dated work. And even though it's unextraordinary to the average person, it does show an early interest in light and shadow, of course. And then I love this drawing of the skeleton of a sparrow over here on the right, because not only is it done on, lined notebook paper, which tells us he was still a very young boy when he did it, but it's an incredible amount of detail. Even the penmanship sort of indicates that he was still very young when he did it. And I wanted to include it because it's important in the way Edward Hopper talks about his work, that for him, the drawing is the connection to reality. And the painting is the extrapolation that involves the imagination and involves creativity and sort of takes it away a little bit from realism. So we can see that his drawings were very much wedded to reality. All right, so here we see Edward Hopper as a young man. This is him over here on the right, and he is working as a part-time illustrator for a company called C.C. Phillips Agency, and they were basically doing trade magazines. So he was, creating images for the covers of trade magazines and some other popular magazines. Do you see how happy he looks in this picture? This is about as happy as he was doing this work. It wasn't really satisfying to him, but his parents thought that this would be a good way for an artist to earn a steady paycheck. And he had actually he had attended a correspondence school for illustration for about a year. So managed to make a career out of it. And here's just a few examples of his work early on. And whenever you look at early work, it's always kind of exciting because you can oftentimes see the seed of what is to come. So even though you wouldn't necessarily pick these, off the wall as Edward Hopper pieces, we see, sort of an interest in theater over here on the left. An interest in sort of quiet figures and dining outside, which we'll see a lot of when he goes to Paris over here on the right. And I believe both of these works are at the Whitney Museum. A lot of his collection is there. So we see a little bit of that, but I should emphasize that working as an illustrator was not something that he really enjoyed. Apparently, having a deadline was really sort of torturous to him. It wasn't anything that helped him to function well or helped him to produce any sort of creative work. So he felt very much stifled under it, but he worked as a commercial illustrator for, I want to say, almost 2 decades here and there. But shortly after attending the correspondence school for illustration, he transferred to the New York School of Art and Design, which is sort of the forerunner to what is today Parsons. And he began to study under the artist that we see here on the left, a man by the name of Robert Henry. And Henry was the leader of, or a main player in what's known as the Ashcan School of Art. This is an example of his work on the right. It's called Snow in New York from 1902. And it was an American movement of art that focused on the sort of invigorating energy of city life. And they painted cities kind of warts and all, which is how you get this name Ashcan School. It kind of refers to painting like literally like cigarette butts and trash and garbage and that sort of thing. But Robert Henry, in addition to being this leader in American modern painting, he was a great teacher, and he was teaching other artists who end up being leading American artists like George Bellows and Rockwell Kent. And so Edward Hopper is a part of this really kind of exciting group of up-and-coming artists, and he learns a great deal from Robert Henry. Robert Henry isn't prescribing a certain way of painting, but Edward Hopper's earliest work, the work that he was accomplishing at that time, sort of reflects the same spirit. This is another self-portrait from 1906 on the right, and a painting of a model sitting from 1902. So he's using kind of these darker tonalities. He's using kind of loose brush strokes, and he's kind of achieving a similar look to what Henry was kind of working with. Now, to sort of round out Edward Hopper's early career, we've got another, or his career in general, I should say, we've got another self-portrait. This is a much later one from 1945, also at the Whitney. And then a painting called The Bootleggers from 1925. And this is in my hometown art museum at the Currier Museum of Art. And to sort of round out this kind of early part of the program and thinking about Edward Hopper in general, this is sort of the spot where we pause and think about, okay, well, he's the leading American realist for the 20th century, but what does that really mean and how does that reflect in his paintings? And I want to say, when you look at an image like The Bootleggers, we can see this, he's very much wedded to recording the intricate details of this architecture, of this mansard roof, of this kind of Victorian style house. He paints it as though he's painting the face of a portrait. But there's so much about the rest of this picture that is painted in such an ambiguous way, whether it's, you know, sort of the suggestion of, I don't know, trees in the background, a fog bank that just sort of curves off the edge over here, the way he delineates this difference of land and sea, even the sea itself. I bring in this picture because it is so, it really just isn't a realistic picture in many ways. The house looks great, but the rest of it is seemingly abstracted in a lot of interesting ways. And of course, again, we get all of the mystery of what's happening between all of these figures. So Edward Hopper ends up painting about 360 major paintings throughout the course of his career, and it's a long career. I would say that's a relatively small number of paintings for how many years he worked. So again, this idea of working under a deadline never suited him well. Sometimes he would just go to the movies for like weeks at a time instead of working because he sort of had this sense of paralysis. And even his friends and other artists sort of talked about, you know, I wish he could just be a happier person. I wish that he could just, you know, pick up a brush and go with it because he was sort of frozen sometimes. So let's talk about him moving a little bit. So in addition to working as an illustrator, he spent a fairly significant amount of time in Paris in this formative part of his career. Particularly in around 1906, 1908, I believe he did 3 trips to Europe, and each of those trips really centered around a long period in Paris. And he wasn't engaged in any sort of formal education while he was there. He wasn't studying under anybody. He just spent a lot of time at the cafes. He was living the life we all want to lead, right? So he would dash off these great pictures of other people at the cafes, interesting people, sometimes prostitutes, but people who are just, you know, living that Parisian lifestyle out at the cafes, drinking outdoors, talking outdoors, capturing these moments of places where we would all want to be, you know, sitting by the Seine with a bottle of wine. Now, while he was there, he was certainly exposed to other artists and other artistic movements. And the best we can glean really is that he was really impressed with what the Impressionists were bringing to the art scene, even after the turn of the century. So Impressionism certainly came to be and sort of rose in the estimation of the French public decades earlier, but it still sort of lingered. So the image that you see here on the left is what I would call sort of a typical Impressionist painting. It's by the artist Camille Pissarro, dates to 1903. And of course, it shows a bridge in Paris. And on the right, we see Edward Hopper's sort of take on the same subject. And right off the bat, you can probably see that his brushwork is not as loose and as broken as an Impressionist. The Impressionists here are not trying to create the illusion of a photograph or a window onto another world. They want you to see the individual dabs of paint. And Edward Hopper is the application of his paint is much smoother, but it's still sort of broken and fragmented enough that we know that is paint on a canvas and not a photograph or a window onto another world. His colors are still fairly dark, though, here. He had been very impressed by Rembrandt when he had traveled in Europe, and of course, he still has these lessons of Robert Henri echoing around in his brain. So the Impressionists, as I said, make an impression on him, and even by the 1960s, really the only sort of group or or really sort of teaching that he gives credit to. He says, I think I'm still an impressionist. So he sort of considered himself a disciple of this style of painting. And after he returns home to New York, after all of these travels, he creates this image a few years later. It's called Soie Bleue. So it even has a French name, and it's from 1914, and it's at the collection of the Whitney Museum. This is such a strange painting, and it's not your typical Edward Hopper painting in many ways. It has that blue background, which the blue always reminds me of Edward Hopper, but everything else here is strange. Edward Hopper, typically speaking, does not create crowded scenes, bustling scenes of people interacting like this. And we've got a real strange cast of characters here. Noticeably a clown, which is really a French subject here. Maybe a lady of the evening, some men over here. This almost looks like it could be Van Gogh behind the pole, but a real sort of interesting cast of characters, people mixing about as they're sitting at these little cafe tables. And then, you know, the interesting element here too of the painting sort of being divided by this column or beam. And that element in particular really reminds me and many other art historians of what the Impressionists were doing. People like Edgar Degas, decades earlier, fragmenting their pictures with these architectural elements that provide a great deal of visual interest as you're documenting what life was like in the Paris cafes and at these bars at nighttime. So even after Edward Hopper returns home, he's still sort of ruminating on these lessons from the Impressionists. And even decades later, I would argue that that the Impressionists were still sort of rattling around in his brain. On the left, we've got a famous Impressionist painting by Claude Monet, sort of, you know, the granddaddy of all Impressionists. This is his San Giorgio Maggiore at dusk from 1912. And Edward Hopper's painting on the right is from 1929, so significantly later. But of course, in both of these pictures, we have these unbelievable sunsets that have painted a rainbow of colors across the sky. And then we have a structure that is sort of silhouetted against it. And of course, Monet's using this, you know, this famous church in Venice, and that's beautiful and incredible. And Edward Hopper, you know, sort of true to being an American artist, uses a railroad tower to silhouette against this incredible sky. We see, again, the Impressionists always have these more active, animated, vibrant brushstrokes, but we see a little bit of it still in Edward Hopper's blue sky up here. So there's always a relationship. And of course, whenever I show this Monet piece, I can't help but reference the Thomas Crown Affair, because if you've ever seen the movie with Pierce Brosnan, that's the picture he steals. So now you know, it's a Monet. But the most important thing about Edward Hopper in Paris is that he was there when some of the most exciting things were happening in the art world. Namely, you have Picasso and Braque, who are basically developing Cubism, you know, the most monumental art movement of the 20th century. And you know what? Edward Hopper said he didn't even hear of him while he was there. So works like this didn't really sort of either interest him or he didn't cross paths with them. So Edward Hopper comes back to New York and that's 1910. And from that point forward, he never leaves the country again. But modernism does follow him back. And just a few years later, there's this huge show called the Armory Exhibit, and that's right in New York City. And it's still famous and still talked about today because you have so many European modernists who were exhibiting work at that show, and the work was groundbreaking. It was avant-garde. It was pictures of the world it was a way to picture the world that nobody had ever really considered before. And the image on the right just gives you a little bit of a snapshot into that. So you have people like Matisse and Duchamp and all that, and they were just, they blew everybody's mind. But of course, there were galleries upon galleries of more traditional artwork there that did not get the same amount of notice. Edward Hopper himself also exhibited at the Armory show, and it was this painting, Sailing, that from 1911, and he actually sold it. It sold for $250, which I think was one of his first oil paintings ever to sell. So that seems like a good start to a painting career, but unfortunately, throughout the 19 teens, living in New York City, Edward Hopper is just not successful. He cannot get traction with his work. And so the work that does sell are his prints, an etching like this one. This is called Night on the L Train from 1918. And what we see here are two sort of shadowy figures on the inside of a train car. And because it's the L train, that means it's the elevated train. So we can see that they are just above a building here. And looking, and this woman in particular has turned away from the inside of the train car, and she's looking at the city skyline just across from her. So this is the kind of image that he could sell. And even when he starts getting some small solo exhibitions, he wasn't even selling his work. So it really took a long time before he could gain some traction. But the prints were doing well. And the prints sort of led him to this idea of kind of looking out of the elevated train and glimpsing people's lives. And these are the kinds of paintings that Edward Hopper started producing in New York City around the 1920s. So the work on the left is called Apartment Houses from 1923. The work on the right is called Night Windows from 1928. And for both of these pictures, you have the sense that you're sort of up above and kind of looking down and into these apartment buildings. And Edward Hopper gives us these incredible little slices of life here where we see these figures who are kind of bent over in action. In some cases, we're looking right through apartments. And he's inviting us, again, to sort of create a story about them, as you would if you were on the train watching, just looking out the window and seeing these little snippets of people's lives. So he's also showing us what life looks like when you're living in a city and it's all congested like this and people are so sort of tightly packed. I mean, this was a new way of living still in the United States. So in addition to just, these little vignettes that you can imagine were inspired by traveling around on the elevated train, he gives us scenes like this one. And this is called New York Restaurant from 1922. And even looking at this now in the age of COVID-19, I'm thinking about a crowded restaurant and how unusual that must have been even for him coming off of the Spanish flu. So, surviving the Spanish flu, not to say that he had it, but to see a crowded scene like this must have been, a change in society and in culture. And I wanted to share this image with you because I think it gives us some insight into how he works, because it's another sort of unusual scene for him in that it's a crowded scene. But it's, to me, all about shapes and forms, the repetition of shapes and forms. So we have these kind of curved chairs in the foreground, and those curves are repeated again in the shapes and the forms of figures, in their shoulders or their backsides. We've got a waitress here who's bussing a table, and I was staring at this giant bow on her back and just sort of wondering about it. And then I see how it's kind of balanced out by this kind of unusual plant that's growing up in the window here. And that plant's big blue vase down here seems to be sort of balanced out by this stylish red hat that the woman at the center is wearing. So Edward Hopper is really concerned about the repetition of shapes and forms, sort of balancing out these kind of chaotic paintings like this, but also creating a snapshot into a world with these kind of unresolved storylines. So there's a lot going on in these pictures, but let's talk about one of his most famous and probably one of my most beloved images of his, which is called The Automat from 1927. And this picture is just so striking to me because what we're seeing is a solitary figure who's eating at a restaurant where all the food is purchased from vending machines. She doesn't interact with anyone to be there, but she is there in what seems like the darkest of nights. She's sitting in front of this giant plate glass window. And we don't see anything outside beyond the window, but we do see the reflection of these electric lights over her head, which seem to draw our eye right to her. And then the sort of inky mass of black that forms this pyramid around her. And then it draws our eyes down to her, and this hat almost creates this kind of protective element around her, brings our eyes down to her shoulders and her hands. There's one glove on a hand and one hand that's ungloved. Makes you think about, is she getting ready to leave? Did she never even take off the other glove? She's already got one plate that's empty, but she almost seems as though she's seeking protection from being viewed from other people. It's really such a striking image of a solitary woman. And of course, art historians over time have sort of speculated, who she is. Is she a lady of the night? That sort of thing. But I always wonder, was she there to meet someone? Has she been stood up? Has her friend or her date already left? Why are they out in the middle of the night? But again, there's all these beautiful kind of formal choices that Edward Hopper made, from the complementing fruit bowl here that adds the splash of color right at the center, to all these like little gold highlights that accent or play off of her hat here. It's just a beautiful picture. So we have a solitary figure in a restaurant. We also have this really striking, gorgeous woman at a movie theater. And Edward Hopper loved movie theaters. This is called New York Movie. It's from 1939, so more than a decade after The Automat. And what he's presenting to us here is the usherette at the theater who, to Edward Hopper's eye, is more interesting than the movie itself. We just get a little bit of the silver screen over here, a mostly empty theater, but the usherette is, showered in this golden light, and she even stands in front of these red curtains as though it's like her own personal stage over here, and she's lost in thought, and she's unaware of us, the viewer, staring at her. So it's a fascinating image because it's all about sort of being an observer of a modern life, being a voyeur too, and sort of speculating about what somebody might be lost in thought about. Some art historians connect this again to the Impressionists and works like the one on the left here by Manet, the Bar at the Folies Bergère from the early 1880s, where we see another woman who's sort of in a working class position, whose gaze is unfocused and who seems, again, sort of lost in thought, maybe imagining a different kind of life for herself as she's being approached by a gentleman who's there to order a drink at the bar. I also connected to other work that was being produced around the same time. Believe it or not, I would say that Norman Rockwell was influenced by Edward Hopper here, because just a few years after New York Movie was painted, Rockwell painted The Hat Check Girl from 1941. And to me, it's the same idea. It's a young, beautiful woman lost in thought with this kind of dead end or kind of boring job. And you can just imagine that she's kind of dreaming of what her life could be like, or what her life beyond this kind of simple job might be. So all of this brings us to the granddaddy of all of these incredible New York paintings, and that is the Nighthawks. And I have a special affinity for this painting, so bear with me. This is from 1942. It's one of the most recognizable paintings in all of American art. And it's absolutely iconic. So before we dive into looking at it, we just have to acknowledge like all the different ways it's been quoted and parodied over the years. Of course, we have the Boulevard of Broken Dreams. I think this was my first exposure to the Nighthawks with like Marilyn Monroe and James Dean. This is from the 1980s. And then even today, there's so many parodies of this painting, from The Simpsons to Star Wars to corgis. It's so interesting to me that there's something about this composition and the relationship of the characters that seems like it's a fitting way to tell a story about characters that we already know and love. There's something fascinating about that. So the Nighthawks is at the Art Institute of Chicago. It was purchased the same year that it was painted, and they purchased it for a mere $3,000, amazingly. Here we see it in the galleries. It's about 5 feet long by about 3 feet tall, just to give you a sense of scale. Now back into the image itself. So what we're looking at here, of course, we are viewers out on a sidewalk, and we can surmise that it's probably the middle of the night because the sidewalks are empty. Most of the storefronts are dark, but we are in this broad swath of sidewalk as we're approaching this diner that wraps around a corner. I just love this rounded corner with the way he's painted the glass here. It almost makes it feel like an aquarium, right? And sort of like a fish in an aquarium, we see these 4 figures in this brightly illuminated diner. And we're drawn in as voyeurs, as viewers, imagining what they're doing out at this time of night, what their relationships are to each other. Is this a couple? Are they there together? And so there's that element of storytelling here. Now, Edward Hopper did tell his biographer, Gail Levin, that this picture was inspired by reading Ernest Hemingway's story, The Killers, which is about some killers at a small town diner before they murder a prize fighter. But obviously that's sort of a loose inspiration here. So let's dive in a little bit closer, and we will actually come back to this painting in a little while too. So what we see here, again, I think it's these ambiguous relationships that really draw people in, because even the man and the woman here that I just referred to as being a couple, you could sort of make the case either way if they're there together. He's got a cigarette in his hands, and it looks like she might be holding a matchbook. Their hands aren't directly touching, but they're very close, and they're seated next to each other in a relatively empty diner, but there's still this space between them. He seems like he's more interested in sort of communicating with the boy working behind the counter here, and she seems kind of lost in thought. Now, just to give you a sense in terms of how Edward Hopper put this picture together, because he worked on it, I believe, over about a month and a half, and he essentially storyboarded it like it was a movie. He started off with just the empty diner itself, and then he began to populate it. Interestingly enough, again, as COVID-19 broke out and people were thinking about empty spaces, you even have this tweet here of, essentially the empty diner and people thinking about the age of coronavirus. And that's a stage in Edward Hopper's process. Over here, we have what is essentially the completed drawing. And if you remember, the drawing is fact for Edward Hopper. The drawing is resolved, and then the painting is the extrapolation. So we have a figure who's seated all the way from behind. We don't see anything of him here. We even have text on the glass. And Edward Hopper gives us a little bit of mystery by showing us his face and opening it up to all this ambiguity by taking away that text and just creating essentially a movie screen for us to watch as the drama unfolds in this space. More of his drawings show just how detailed he was, how methodical. I love that he's like actually labeling the color of what would be inside a maple syrup container. You also have those sort of like space age coffee carafes or coffee pots in the background that he sort of plotted out there. So he really planned every aspect of this picture. And then in the end, we get this beautiful painting that is so ambiguous, and it really draws us in. So like I said, we'll be returning to this in sort of our final section, but I wanted to have this chance to introduce you. And I also wanted to introduce you to Edward Hopper's wife, who, I should quickly say, was the model for this redhead in Nighthawks too. So here she is. Her name's Josephine Hopper. And this is a painting of her by Edward Hopper's painting teacher, Robert Henry. And the painting here is from about 1906. Jo Hopper was also a painter in her own right. You can see the paintbrushes in her hands here. And she and Edward Hopper were sort of, so they knew each other as students, and then they're sort of reunited in their 40s, and they dated for a year, and then they married. And they lived in a very spare fourth floor walk-up in Washington Square Park. And after they were married, she served as not only his model, virtually one of his only models for the next several decades. She also served as like a manager to him and an art historian and a negotiator. The image on the right is one of the few paintings of her, a self-portrait by her that dates to 1956. And the image on the left is a rare painting, a rare portrait of her by Edward Hopper, and that dates to 1936. So even though he was painting her all the time as his model, it was pretty unusual for him to paint her as in terms of a portrait. And I think part of that is because they were very different personalities. So here we have a photograph of the two of them together. And they bickered quite a bit. They fought quite a bit. She was like this small, sort of outgoing bundle of energy, and he was this big, lumbering, sort of morose kind of man. And so their marriage was filled with a great deal of strife. There was definitely some physical violence, apparently on both ends. Apparently, after they celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary, Jo suggested they both deserved a medal for distinguished combat. And one of the ways that they fought with each other was that Edward Hopper would draw these like mean little cartoons about her and leave them around the house. So the image that we have here is them fighting with their hands in each other's faces, and the caption is, "He cannot choose but hear." So when you get into somebody's face, certainly a few more of these kind of vindictive cartoons from their marriage. This one is called Mealtime, and of course, here he is feeling like he is not a very well-fed husband. She often refused to cook. And then here we have the sacrament of sex, the female version. So clearly he felt somewhat powerless in this relationship oftentimes, but it wasn't always bad. Jo Hopper encouraged him to work in different media. She pushed him to work in watercolors. And these are two watercolors that he painted of her. I guess you could qualify them as portraits again, but she is, seen from the back. There's an emotional remoteness here. So here she's painting in their Cape Cod house, and here she's painting in the car in Wyoming. And this is a good segue to Cape Cod, because Cape Cod it plays such a huge role in Edward Hopper's career. So they began going in 1930, and then just a few years later, they decided to build a house in Truro, right on the water. This is their house. He's sitting just in front of it. Jo is off in the distance. This is a little cartoon that he did about the house that Jo built. So of course he was critical of how it turned out, but Cape Cod proves to be really fertile ground for him, and he paints over 100 oil paintings and watercolors depicting the Cape over the next few decades. So Let's take a look at a few of them. And just knowing that we're a little bit short on time, I might move through these a little bit quickly. So the image that we have here is called The Lee Shore. It's from 1941. And we have these beautiful sailboats on this, stunning expanse of sea with just a few sort of whipped up white clouds in the background, kind of echoing the shape of those sails. But in typical Edward Hopper fashion, he's giving us this kind of ambiguous relationship between the water, the land, and the architecture. And this is what oftentimes pushes his pictures more into the realm of surrealism rather than just realism. You feel like that house is kind of hovering out over the water, and that sailboat could have just sailed right into it. But the colors here are just gorgeous, and they're so peaceful. But a lot of, and I should mention here too, some of Edward Hopper's paintings of the Cape are just images like this one that are not populated. And whenever I see this picture, I'm reminded of the Edward Hopper quote that is, "Maybe I'm not very human. What I wanted to do was paint sunlight on the side of a house." And I think he really got to do that when he was in Cape Cod in particular. So this is Cornhill, Truro that we're looking at here. Many of his Cape images look a lot like his New York City images in that that we have these solitary figures that are sort of bathed in sunlight, but we still get this sense of kind of sadness as we look at them. This image, which is called Cape Cod Morning, it's at the Smithsonian. It dates to 1950. It's so similar to that one that we started off with this evening, which called Morning Sun from just 2 years later. It's it's a different version of that same pink dress or pink slip, and it's the same woman essentially looking out a window, and possibly contemplating her day, contemplating her life. It's hard to say. And instead of having, the sunlight on the wall, but behind her here in the Cape Cod picture, again, we can sort of see through the architecture. Interestingly enough, we know that that Joe Hopper sort of took notes and kind of annotated what a lot of these paintings were about. And sometimes she would build these stories about these characters or what they were doing. And I think for this one in particular, she wrote something to the effect of like, oh, she's planning her day as she's looking out the window, thinking about the weather and planning her day. And Edward Hopper said, "Don't do that. Don't create a story. I'm not Norman Rockwell. That's not what this is about." He wanted to leave it ambiguous. And with an image like this, that's exactly what he achieves. We have Cape Cod Evening from 1939 here. This is at the National Gallery of Art. And I always think of this as a really great example of how ambiguous his paintings could be. So we have this, what we could imagine is probably a couple here. Her arms are crossed as though she's upset. He's not looking at her. They're aside this beautiful architecture, this lovely Victorian, but the landscape all around them is sort of unattended to. And then we've got this gorgeous collie dog who's almost right at the center of the picture, who seems to be alert and almost weary of something that's outside of the frame, something that the humans haven't even become aware of yet. So there's all this ambiguity between the living creatures here and even the relationship of sort of man-made structures to the natural world here. We know that Edward Hopper would paint in his car, and we know that sometimes he just, he needed new scenery in order to gain a little inspiration. So a painting like this one that's called Rooms for Tourists at Yale University Art Gallery, this is from 1945, we know that he just got in his car and drove around the Cape and then found a building that sort of interested him. And I think with this picture in particular, he was probably hoping to see, a little vignette or a story unfolding with figures, but oftentimes when he painted Victorian architecture, that alone kind of served as an interesting face for him. Without a doubt, I would say this is Edward Hopper's most famous Cape painting, which is called Rooms by the Sea. This is also at Yale. It's from 1951. And this is another really stunning picture where we have this totally ambiguous relationship between architecture and ocean. we have this open door where you feel like you could just walk right out or fall into the ocean. He actually had a subtitle for this picture, which he eventually sort of let go of, and it was called The Jumping Off Point. And people attached a really sort of morbid sense to what that meant. So he said, let's just call it Rooms by the Sea. And so this is a picture, even though it is about the ocean, it's really about that sunlight spilling in too. And so we've got, this kind of interesting shape of the sunlight. We've got this empty room here, and we've got, all of the cool and the warm of what it feels like to be on the Cape in the summertime, but then all of this strange sense of ambiguity where, again, we're sort of moving from realism to surrealism really quickly. And I just wanted to quickly connect that back to, again, even some of his earliest pictures, which show this kind of fondness for the ocean, even at a young age. This is actually another illustration that he did in 1906 that's called The Boy in the Moon. And we can see a young man who's waking up in his bed, and the architecture around him is sort of crumbling and then almost dissolving out, so that he has this beautiful access to the ocean and the moon setting or rising just beyond it. So certainly the ocean and the beach have been a steady point of interest for him throughout his career. So, all right, film noir. Now, Edward Hopper, as I mentioned, loved the movies. He would go and escape at the movies like so many of us do. And particularly when he was stuck in his work, he would go there and I think sometimes find inspiration, which is so perfect because there have been so many directors and actors since who have looked at his work for inspiration. And I bring in this term film noir because that's a great connection to his style of painting. Film noir is basically, crime dramas from the 1940s and the 1950s. They're really heavy on style, and they're the kinds of things that you would see that sort of look like Edward Hopper's etching here, Night Shadows from 1921, where you're looking down at a figure. There's like these, who's, walking the streets at night by himself, up to no good, probably, but, these long shadows and a lot of mystery that goes along with it. But in particular, Edward Hopper's work is oftentimes most compared to, or most sort of correlated to, the work of Alfred Hitchcock. So Hopper's iconic painting, House by the Railroad from 1925, which is at the MoMA, certainly served as inspiration for Hitchcock's house in the movie Psycho and subsequent however many sequels were made to that movie. So Edward Hopper's painting is, of course, like a portrait of this kind of grim depiction of this Victorian architecture, this kind of mysterious, shadowy house here that's made even more forlorn by how it's kind of cut off from the world by these train tracks. And that is exactly what Alfred Hitchcock wanted to capture in his movies. In fact, he wanted this exact same perspective so much that even though budgets were short, he just built those two walls of that house in order to achieve that same view that Edward Hopper had captured in his painting decades earlier. We also have the idea of Edward Hopper as kind of a voyeur looking into people's rooms from the L train as he traveled around New York City. And that was certainly could have played inspiration to Hitchcock with movies like Rear Window, where you have somebody who's kind of peeking out of their own apartment windows into the windows of neighbors nearby and kind of imagining what those relationships are that you can just glimpse through a window. The image over here on the left by Edward Hopper is called Room in New York from 1932. Where we see a couple and we don't really know what's going on between them. Are they fighting? Is this just is this a typical evening for them? But Edward Hopper is telling us that we are on the outside here. We've got the frame of the window. And that's certainly how things kind of play out in the wonderful movie Rear Window too. You're on the outside and you're speculating based on what you can see through those windows. You have other directors who directly quote Edward Hopper paintings. There's a 1981 film called Pennies from Heaven that stars Steve Martin, actually, in a romantic musical drama that I guess was a box office flop. But the director here directly quotes several Edward Hopper paintings, from Nighthawks to New York Movie. Sorry for the grainy picture there. And then if any of you had a chance to see the Perry Mason, updated version of Perry Mason on HBO this summer, I think a lot of that was inspired by kind of the film noir aesthetic. And then also, of course, Edward Hopper's painting. So you have Perry Mason over here on the right, and then the Edward Hopper painting that's called Conference at Night, 1949. So this sense of people gathering in an office space in off hours to achieve maybe sort of unseemly goals. All right, so our last section here, which I am probably the most excited about, so please hang on with me, is our section called Beyond Realism. So we've been thinking about Edward Hopper's paintings as direct depictions of the world around us. And this last section here is to sort of titillate our brains into thinking that really a lot of his pictures are responding to what's happening in the art world and integrating that in interesting ways. So we go back to Night Shadows from 1921, that etching on the right, and these kind of lonely scenes of empty cities is not something that Edward Hopper invented. In fact, we see the painting by the Italian artist Cherico on the right from more than a decade earlier. And he was an artist who specialized in these kind of empty, abandoned cityscapes with these long shadows. And these paintings are almost always categorized as surrealist paintings. They're not meant to be factual depictions of the world around us, but there's that interest in the architecture and the isolation that comes along with it. Other ways that Edward Hopper, I think, is responding to the art world around him, I think really come out in a picture like this one that's called Chop Suey from 1929. And I feel like I sort of stumbled into this as I was looking at this picture, because when you look at it, your eye just goes to this beautiful woman in the tight green sweater who looks like she could be looking out at you. And then you just, your brain just rests and relaxes and you think, okay, it's a realistic picture. I can even see the Chop Suey sign just out the window. But what is going on with this screen that's on the glass, seemingly between the diners here and that sign? And I mean, take a look at that. That is a mess. That is not the way that Edward Hopper paints a picture. We've got a little bit of green here. We can see the sign through this screen. It's a really strange element to this picture, and it's right there practically at the center. And unless you spend a lot of time with this picture, it's hard to know what he's trying to achieve. My theory is that he's aware of non-objective painting that is happening around him, and he's sort of trying to play with it. This screen that he's painted here offers up the opportunity to create his own little Kandinsky, or something like a Kandinsky on it. So the image on the right here is by the Russian painter Vasily Kandinsky from 1913. And he would make these images called improvisations, which I think Edward Hopper was essentially doing over here, where we can see elements that look recognizable. We can see it's sort of this play of color and form and just kind of experimenting. And I think Edward Hopper was allowing himself to do that. So after I noticed that screen, I looked at the other window in this picture, and I noticed that we have what seems like almost beams of light in what I would imagine would otherwise be an alley. And I think that window in particular, and what's happening out that window, is probably Edward Hopper responding to another American artist, in this case, Charles Demuth. and his iconic painting, My Egypt, from just 2 years before Chop Suey was painted. And so we see that Charles Demuth is creating these beams of light, this really sort of dynamic and fragmented vision of, industrial architecture in this case, that becomes invigorated by how he's just painted the space around it in this really sort of dramatic and avant-garde way. And I think you get a little bit of a suggestion of that in a very, which would be a very non-Edward Hopper way to paint, but maybe a little window allows him to practice that. And I think there's actually a lot of experimentation in the Nighthawks. So just bear with me. one of the ways I see that in particular is with the door all the way over here on the right. Now there's so much about this painting that is painted in a way that at least looks illusionistic, not necessarily like a window onto another world, but real enough that we know, this is exactly a step into a doorway. But this door to me has always looked so incredibly flat. There's no door jamb around it. It's just like a rectangle with a square in it. And to me, it seems like it's Edward Hopper sort of responding to the work of other artists at the time, artists like Paul Klee, who are just playing with color and form in a work like the one on the left, which is called Ancient Sound. And for Paul Klee, you don't need to be painting a story. You don't need to be painting anything in the natural world around us. You just need to be using, these rough shapes and interesting colors together. And the palette here almost looks similar to what we see with Edward Hopper's painting. The other element, this is a stretch from Nighthawks, which always gets me, is those coffee pots and what's happening with the coffee pots there. You remember that was a big focus in his drawing in his preparatory work for this painting, but my eye goes to this drip between those coffee pots. And you can look at this picture in high resolution, pull it up on Wikipedia, move it all around your computer screen, and there is not another drip in this picture. So this drip to me is very intentional, and it's very avant-garde. It might be just the suggestion of coffee running out, but it's also him playing with the way he's applying paint to the canvas here. Now, I'm not saying that Edward Hopper was doing drip paintings before Jackson Pollock, but he is experimenting in interesting ways, and allowing that drip to be there was an avant-garde move on his part. So just a few more connections to modernism very quickly. This is a picture from 1953. It's at the Met. It's called Office in a Small City. And this is a classic Hopper setup in that we are looking in a window at a figure who's in an interior space, and then we can see out his window through this building. And along the right side, we see the architecture of this small city, these rounded windows and cornices. And then through this window, we see sort of a slightly different version of that same building, where everything seems to be sort of flat and angular. And then beyond it, a really sort of modern 1950s looking building. And I think that Edward Hopper here might be playing with again, some of the color field paintings that were popular in the 1950s, and in particular, that modern building in the background really reminds me of Barnett Newman and his zipped paintings with the line going right through them. You can sort of see that in that modern building over here. So I think Edward Hopper finds these opportunities to create these little modernist or avant-garde masterpieces within his realist paintings. And by the time we get to the last decade or so of his life, I think he's really found ways to kind of boil down his painting. So we had Rooms by the Sea from 1951 that we saw before. And then the image on the right is called Sun in an Empty Room from 1963. So this is just a few years before he died. And we don't see any of the real kind of glorious detail that we see in Rooms by the Sea. Instead, it's really sort of this meditation on light, shadow, and form. And I think you could even boil it down to kind of the essence of painting here. So I've brought in a painting by Mark Rothko, another color field painter who actually credits Hopper with being an inspiration for him. And I think there's a really strong connection here between what they were doing. I mean, if you look carefully, even the suggestion of nature outside that window is rendered so simplistically. It's that you can't even call it realism. So instead, I mean, what we're seeing here is really more akin to the modernist works that were happening in the 1960s at this time. All right, so to rein it all back in and to wrap it up for us here, we have Edward Hopper's legacy. Well, we know he and his wife had this really sort of tough relationship, and that he was kind of a cantankerous man. And we saw this kind of play out in some of his paintings. I think that's why we get that overwhelming sense of loneliness. And we have that idea of him being at his core, this young boy who doesn't want to work against deadlines, who's really interested in capturing the reality of things in his drawings and then extrapolating that into his paintings. Well, he and Jo do stay together through the rest of their lives. Hopper died in his studio at the age of 60, or in 1967, at the age of 84. This is them at MoMA just a few years before that. Jo dies just 10 months later, and they're buried in his hometown of Nyack, New York. Before Jo dies, she bequeaths 3,000 works by Hopper, including drawings and that sort of thing, to the Whitney Museum. And a gift like that was unprecedented in the history of American art museums. She also gave the collection of her work too, and believe it or not, as far as I know, this still holds true. The Whitney really only kept about 3 of her paintings and then sort of re-gifted the rest of them to spaces where women wait and pass through. So you might find them in like hospital waiting rooms and that sort of thing around New York City. Edward Hopper's reputation has been on the rise for quite some time, even before everybody starts reassessing his work in the age of coronavirus. This painting here, Chop Suey, was auctioned off for a record $91.9 million. Every few years, one of his paintings comes up for sale at auction, and essentially the price doubles. There's not a lot of them available. So clearly there's interest, and his work is up there, and it's selling with prices sort of akin to like Warhol and Hockney. So that about wraps up everything that we could cover tonight in terms of Edward Hopper. And we've seen sort of what has inspired him over the course of his career, and maybe how he's kind of played with and responded to other things that were happening in the art world at this time. So thank you for bearing with me a little bit late tonight, and I welcome any questions or comments that you might have.
Thank you so much, Jane. That was wonderful. And it just always feels like your presentations just feel like walking through an art museum these days with a real expert who's kind of not only pointing out the ways that the history of the art that's in front of you, but also the ways to look at the art. Like, I feel like I've learned so much over the course of your series. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So so Edward Hopper is primarily at the Whitney, most of his works?
That's right.
Okay. Are there any locally in Boston?
Yes, so the MFA definitely has a good collection. There's the bootleggers up in Manchester, New Hampshire. I think most art museums that have any sort of American focus, they have to have like their one Edward Hopper painting. But I think for the most part, the bulk of them are at the Whitney.
Okay. I think I saw one, a couple maybe at the the Smithsonian for American Art
Mm-hmm.
and Folk Museum. I think
Mm-hmm.
that's what it's called. But the Cape Cod ones are really beautiful. I have to
Oh, they
get,
really are. They really
yeah,
are.
so much light. So yeah, everyone's just saying like, thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. Everyone really loved it. For anyone who's still online with us, if you're on your way out, Will C says, I learned some new perspectives and a very interesting lecture. Thank you so much. Um, and if you don't have any questions, please join us next time on November. Just had it up here. It is Tuesday, November the 24th at 7 p.m. When Jane will be covering Heroes and Homecomings, Norman Rockwell and World War II, just in time for Thanksgiving. So that should be really, really nice. A really nice program for the holidays. And we also have Vincent van Gogh in December, which is going to be really excellent.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's really
Thank you
great.
so much, everyone.
Someone said they loved the connection between Hopper and the other artists. I thought that was really neat too. I never thought about connecting about him being a bridge between the Impressionists and the more contemporary
It's
artists.
so fascinating to me too, because it just seems like he's always just stood alone in his own right, and everybody just said he did what he did, and he was an independent artist who always seemed, like he was never influenced by anybody else. But I think that's nearly impossible, right?
Yeah, I know. Yeah, no, I mean, don't artists? I mean, the motto is artists steal, right? That's or I mean, borrow. I suppose is a better term for it. Um, and the connection with Hitchcock was interesting too. I also thought that was interesting, his comment about being not wanting to be considered like Rockwell.
Yes, he really tried to avoid creating paintings that had stories to them. He
Hmm.
wanted everything to be ambiguous, and he wanted us to be able to fill in our own narrative there, which is really smart because I think that's what makes these paintings still so fascinating in so many ways.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. Is the Addison Gallery had a painting in the 90s? I'm not sure if it's still there, but the Addison Gallery had a painting in the 90s.
They have such a great collection. I can't think of offhand which hopper they have, but I'm almost positive it's still there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, so we'll let you go, Jane. Thank you so much for your extra time tonight. We really appreciate it. And anyone who wants to sign up for the next lecture, check out our website. If you go to our calendar, there's the registration form there.
I will see you then. Take care,
All
everyone.
right. Thanks. Have a good night.
Good night.